Excellent. Hello, everybody, and happy Thanksgiving. Welcome in, Chameleon Cat. How are you doing today? I hope everybody had a good day and got to spend it with family or friends, or just by yourself in your room, alternating between sleeping and stuffing your face, if that's what you prefer. I actually had a really good one. I ended up going to Thanksgiving dinner with my coworker and a couple of his relatives and another friend. Actually, I had a dinner on the Queen Mary, which is an extremely large boat. It knows how to make a mean turkey and stuffing. But got home fairly late, and I'd been promising I would do a bonus audiobook stream so we can continue this novel and finish it this year. Well, preferably before I go home for Christmas. And I thought tonight might be a good time. We'll see if we can get through another couple of chapters. And thank you to everybody who came out to my last couple of streams. On Wednesday, we made good progress in A Nameless Inheritance, till we got eaten by giant worms. And before that, we were playing Nancy Drew, the White Wolf of Icicle Creek. Got eaten by large wolves. Well, maybe not exactly. Too busy finding other ways to die in that game. Like, who knew? Falling through the ice could be, well, if not fatal, at least get you sent home. But tonight we'll continue this interesting public domain horror novel. It's weird to think this was published like exactly 100 years ago. It's a long time. It's longer than I've been alive. Yeah, that's right. Math was never my strong point. And as a reminder, put up make sure a couple of key differences. And I'm doing an audiobook stream. Yes, there. Put up that, and I'll also turn off or mute the tab that does alerts in my browser so they won't distract me. But yes, I'm turning off alerts and won't be responding to chat until after I finish reading, just so I can keep the flow going, and it'll be easier to turn these into audiobooks someday. I've been promising to release audio files of these on LibriVox for 3 years? 4? You know what? Who's counting? So, Thanksgiving horror stream of Cold Harbor. Chapter 6. Mr. Furnival. And sat down to tea, Ronald Wake continued, at a round table in the window niche of what I suppose was the Furnivals' dining room. I'm afraid we've been describing the rooms at Cold Harbor like house agents. Looking at it from one point of view, the house is half the story, and, in any case, this part of it was so different from all the rest that I mustn't pass it over. In shape it corresponded with the library on the floor above, but in its decoration and the feeling that it gave us, nothing could have been more different. No Dark Ages, no languid pre-Raphaelites here. The panels blazed with pictures which seemed to have been chosen for their gaiety and vividness. All modern. Over the fireplace there was an opulent flaming thing by Brangwyn, Renoir, Matisse, Laura Knight. A curious, exciting mixture. Against that background they shone out like old glass. Furnival saw the contrast had taken me aback. "This is what I call my kill or cure surprise packet," he said with a sweep of his hand. There's nothing like a bit of kaleidoscope for change, particularly at mealtimes. It gives one an appetite, huh? Certainly, there wasn't anything wrong with his. He sat down at the table between us and began to wolf great slabs of rich cake at an enormous rate, chaffing poor Evelyn on the smallness of hers, which was perfectly normal. He seemed so cheerful that you'd have thought he'd had another drink on the way down, though of course I knew that he hadn't. The idea of drugs passed through my mind. I looked at him with medical eyes and decided no. I'm a real Midlander in one thing, he said, and that is that I fancy my spot of tea as much as a schoolboy. What's more, talking makes one hungry. I should have thought that you, Mrs. Wake, would be famished after an hour of my wife's gossip. Now, do have another piece of this cake, or I shall be forced to finish it. Evelyn shook her head. By this time I guessed that something had upset her. I couldn't ask her what it was. I just wondered if she were suffering from the horrification of goose-flesh that still rippled up and down my spine. I tried to help her out. Perhaps you haven't been talking, I said. Not talking? You trust my wife? Said Mr. Furnival, laughing with his mouth full. Yes, we've been talking all the time, said Evelyn in a subdued, significant voice. He laughed again, but I could see he knew what she was driving at. He glanced quickly from her to Mrs. Furnival, then screwed up his eyes and stared at her full in the face. Well, Mrs. Wake, he said. I only want to know what you think of it, Evelyn answered, as calmly as you like. What I think of it? He repeated. That's very mysterious. What I think of what? Of the house, and the things that happen in it, she said. Oh, that's easily answered, he said. I don't waste my time. Life's too short for that, my dear lady. I don't think of it at all. You'll have to, sooner or later, she said. They went on sparring for a minute or two like this. It was a curious situation for me. You see, I'd heard none of the stories that Mrs. Furnival had told her, and hadn't any clear idea what Evelyn was driving at, though I could see by her grim face that she was determined to pin him down. And Mrs. Furnival didn't help us with a word. She just sat there, perched behind her tea things, like a starved sparrow in the snow. Then, little by little, putting together Evelyn's questions and Furnival's replies, I began to tumble to the meaning of her catechism. Incident by incident, she was taking him through the whole list of horrors that Mrs. Furnival had confided to her. Inch by inch, Furnival was fighting the suggestion that he could be in any way connected with them. Even to an outsider, the contest was good sport. You can imagine me in the position of a stranger who drops into the law courts in the middle of a case about which he knows nothing, and has to pick up the threads of argument as they appear. They began with Jerry. Furnival was prepared to admit that the Jerry phenomenon existed, but not, for a moment, that such things were unusual or necessarily unpleasant. The records of that sort of thing were full of poltergeists. Possibly she'd heard of the Wesley case. Yes, the famous Wesley, the great nonconformist. He had been troubled by a spirit of this kind, to whom he'd given a nickname. As long as Jerry doesn't keep me awake, Mr. Furnival said, he's welcome to his antics. Luckily, he prefers the parsons. From Jerry they passed on to the visions that had troubled the two children, the bloody corpse on the bedroom floor, and the stream of blood that had gushed out of the stones of the house. It's no good asking me things like that, he said. If you want to get at the root of them, you'd better interview the cook. She's the person responsible. Indigestion, nightmare. Have you ever heard of a highly strung child? They get that from their mother, not from me, who hasn't suffered from imagination of some kind. Evelyn stuck to her guns. Imagination, yes. Of that kind, no. Nightmares were freakish things, but these visions were consistent. Well, supposing I admit that, said Furnival, it takes you no further. All nightmares have their origin in impressions received during waking hours. In this case, no doubt, The children had heard their mother talking. Mrs. Furnivall, still fixedly smiling, shook her head. She knew better than to dispute with him. But Mrs. Furnivall, Evelyn contended, wouldn't have spoken of anything she hadn't experienced herself. "Ah, wouldn't she?" he cackled. "A woman who upholds the apostolic succession is not to be trusted, in my opinion, on any question of fact." The sneer evidently pleased him. He went on chuckling for a moment or two. Mrs. Furnivall didn't turn a hair. I suppose the poor thing was used to it, and Evelyn renewed her attack. The hag-ridden Mr. Lowe? Why, Mr. Lowe, he scoffed, was no better than his poor deluded wife. A credulous, superstitious, weak-minded fellow, of the stamp of which Roman Catholic converts were made. He refused even to discuss Mr. Lowe. "Moonshine, my dear lady, moonshine." Muriel and her refusal of the sacrament? That was another case of the same kind. Women and effeminate priests. With all respect to Evelyn's own sex, the facts were significant. No healthy, normal male had ever been troubled in Cold Harbour, nor ever would be. It was no good talking to him about the abbot of St. Chad's and his broken chalice. The chalice was 1,000 years old, and made of crystal. After all, there was such a thing as the law of averages, and in the ordinary way that chalice should have been broken ages ago. No doubt Mrs. Furnivall's stories had made the wretched fellow tremulous with fright. Unconscious muscular tremor. What about the hazel twigs that snap off short in the fingers of the water diviner? The chalice broke, in short, in obedience to some natural physical law. Its time had come, and there was an end of the matter. "There's nothing," he went on, "in all that Mrs. Furnivall has been silly enough to tell you, that can't be explained along the same reasonable lines." "You're forgetting Miss Harrow," said Evelyn slowly. "I should like to know how you explain that." "Ah, Miss Harrow," he laughed softly. "Yes, that, I'll admit, was a curious case. Very remarkable. It all happened in a moment. We'd come in from a walk in the moonlight, you know. I was just sitting down in the hall outside here, taking off my boots." "Yes, I've heard about the boots," Evelyn interrupted. "Mrs. Furnivall told me. I think those boots are a significant part of the story." He pulled her up sharply. "Now what do you mean by that?" "Because they gave you an alibi," she said. His mouth twitched upwards in a grimace. "So you think I need one, Mrs. Wake? Well, there it is, isn't it, in any case?" He laughed again, to himself. "I suppose we shall have to saddle Jerry with that. We've admitted Jerry, haven't we? And if Jerry is capable of moving furniture and playing tricks on the parson's braces, we may as well give him credit for scratching Miss Harrow's face. Certainly something did scratch it. The marks were quite plain. And as for terror, I must say that I've never seen a human being in such a blue funk in my life. Yes, Mrs. Wake, I'll grant you Miss Harrow, but I'm damned if I'll grant you anything else. Would you like me to establish my alibi in all the other cases? If you attach any importance to it, I think I could do so, with my wife's assistance. Well, well, I congratulate your husband. You're a very wide-awake young woman." He looked at her with a teasing, challenging smile, which made me so conscious of the antagonism between them that I felt it my duty to break a silence that might have ended in plain speaking. Evelyn is dreadfully direct, and, after all, the man was our host. "Of course," I said, "I'm rather in the dark about the details of the things which you're discussing. They all sound to me extremely unpleasant, whatever may have caused them. Uncanny things seem to have happened in this house to a large number of very different people, and, naturally, one would feel more comfortable if they could be explained. There's just one point that strikes me. I should like to know if the house has always had a bad reputation of that kind." "Now that," said Furnivall, "is the impersonal question of a man of science, not of an amateur detective. I quite agree with you, and the answer is yes. I didn't know it when first I took the house. The Pomfret trustees, or rather their solicitors, didn't tell me so, though it may have had something to do with the low figure at which I got the lease. But it is a fact that Cold Harbour has been said to be haunted for the last 100 years. The farm labourers in the district know quite a number of tales about it. I've heard them discussing it in the Fox, but I'm afraid they're all of a very conversational pattern and don't help us much, except as an alibi, he added, with a mischievous glance at Evelyn. You see, I've only been here 15 years. Then there's another point, I went on. It seems to me curious that none of the incidents we've been discussing have been connected with servants working in the house. That strikes me as strange. Right again, Furnivall admitted. It is curious. There was Rose, Mrs. Furnivall put in gently. Rose was a neurotic little donkey, Furnivall snapped. Rose would have been all right if you'd left her alone. I always told you so. She said that she saw things, Mrs. Furnivall mildly protested. Rose is the only one, said Mr. Furnivall irritably. Still, Rose counts, I suggested, and it really does seem that a certain percentage of the people who come to the house are liable to unpleasant adventures. I think you've mentioned 9 cases of the kind, not counting Mrs. Furnivall and yourself. You needn't count me, he snapped. I've told you already that I've never felt anything abnormal, and I don't believe that any normal person does. Still, it is a fact, as you say, that a certain proportion, say 60%, of our visitors do, and that, he laughed softly, does make entertaining rather difficult. He put it so whimsically that I was forced to laugh too, although his temper appeared to be improving so rapidly that, in spite of Evelyn's continued dark disapproval, I felt there was something to be got out of him. I should like to know, I said, how you explain all this. I don't explain it, he answered shortly. You haven't any theory? I persisted. I knew in my bones that he had. Whether he believed in his theory was another matter. Well, if you want a theory, I'll give you one, he said, but you must realize that I offer it entirely without prejudice, as the lawyers say. Quite, that's understood, I told him. Very well, he said. It's understood that what I'm going to tell you is merely romantic moonshine. You have to give the women a fable to play with. He settled back in his chair, preparing to enjoy himself, putting the tips of his fingers together, staring up at the ceiling as if he expected to find his inspiration there. And certainly, there or somewhere else he found it. Looking backward, I confess myself in agreement with your Dr. Morehouse. Amazingly dynamic, the most striking personality in the Midlands, and all this, mind you, not because of his personal appearance, but in spite of it, and in spite of a prejudice on my part that by this time amounted to, well, loathing's the only word. Evelyn's spoken already about his voice. I don't know, even now, that I should call it beautiful, but as for persuasiveness, I should say that no living orator has ever affected me more deeply. A voice of gold, not that, a voice of crystal, and in the crystal, the flaw of that demoniac laugh. Anyway, it's a waste of time to talk about things that can't be heard. This, more or less, is how his explanation, his apologia, went. I think, he said, that when you asked me if Cold Harbour had a bad reputation in the past, you were very near to hitting the right nail on the head. Of course, you didn't mean what I mean. You only wanted to know if there were any ghost stories connected with it, and I answered that there were, meaning just the ordinary superstitious rubbish that accumulates around every building with a long record of human habitation. There are very few old houses, in fact, that haven't gathered some accretions of that sort. But if you'd asked me, more generally, if I thought there was anything unusual in the position of the house and its history, apart from local superstitions, I should have been forced to say yes again, as a matter of fact. Mark you, and not for one moment admitting any of the physical implications that some people would attach to it. You know my position already. I'm a complete skeptic, or rather, a complete agnostic in those matters. I only offer you the material. the turnip and the candle out of which to build your bogey, if you want one, as most people do. Very well. We'll start a few thousand years ago. Imagine yourself for a moment standing on the terrace at the back of the house. There may have been buildings there then. I don't know. I should think that very probably there were. Now run your eye over the prehistoric landscape. The outlines of the hills you see today must be very much as they were. Penbeacon and Ulfdown behind you, westward, the Clees and the Wrekin. No Uriconium in those days. North and east, line of the high Midlands Plateau, a regular amphitheatre of hills, a tremendous cup, saucer is better, in the bottom of which lies thick, impenetrable forest. The Mercian forest, they called it later, but I'm speaking of a time before the Saxons came. And now comes a curious point. This little knoll on which Cold Harbour stands is a key position. Possibly I'm not using the term rightly. I know nothing about soldiering. But my point is this. From Cold Harbour you can command every important station of the Neolithic religions extant in this part of the Midlands, from the stones on Penbeacon to the circles over in Shropshire. There's no other sight in this part of the country of which you can say that. It's the visual, if not the geographical centre of them all, and in those days, of course, there was no smoke to hamper one's vision. For that reason, I like to think that Cold Harbour was in those days a pagan centre of importance. I can't prove it. All this is sheer theorizing, but I think there's a case to go to the jury. Huh? He waited for my approval. As long as this doesn't form the basis of your argument, I began. There is no argument, he protested. I'm merely offering you suggestions on which to build your blessed theories. If the day were clearer, I could show you what I mean, but let that pass. Let's skip a few hundred years. At this point of the world's history, centuries don't go for much. Now we're in the period of the Roman conquest. Our old friend Boudica, or Boadicea, huh? And now we have something to go on. At that time, our friend old Gaius, centurion of the 20th Legion, set up his altar to Astarte. Seeing's believing, huh? Why did old Gaius take the trouble to set up his altar here? We've touched on that already. Because he found a grove here ready-made? Possibly. But there's one curious thing about the Romans. They had, as you know, a habit of adopting to their own uses not only the deities but the religious sites of the people they conquered, and my opinion is that this old boy stuck up his altar here because he knew, from local gossip, that it was an important religious site, a place where other people, who knew a great deal more about the nature of the country, had celebrated religious rites for centuries. Or again, Gaius may have been playing for safety. He may have thought to himself, now here's a spot that has been saturated for centuries, incalculable, with the power of the old gods and goddesses, who may play the mischief with a poor foreigner like myself. Damned if I won't put a little reasonable religion into it on my own account. Possibly he thought he'd better be on the safe side both ways, and in any case he stuck up his altar, just as my wife stuck up her oratory, because, for some reason or other, the place frightened him. He was what she'd call one of the unlucky ones. At any rate, he went on, there you are, in the 1st century, with at least 2 layers of religion, and pretty ugly religions at that. You know for yourself what Astarte worship implies. You've read Fraser? It's a subject that you can't discuss before ladies. Ha! How long it lasted, I can't tell you. Probably, in some form or other, for hundreds of years. Anyhow, the odds are that when the Saxon Christians invaded Mercia, it was still persisting in some form or other. Why? Ha! There you think you've got me, but you haven't, not by a long way. By this time we're entering the period of recorded history, and can argue from known facts. The facts are these. In the Saxon period, call it the 8th or 10th century A.D., the people of this district felt it incumbent on them to build a church. Did they build it to cope with the religious needs of a larger population? Not at all. At no period in history has this bit of country been important from that point of view. All the human activities of the district at the time of the conquest were centered in Halesby, just about 4 miles away. From that point of view, there wasn't, and never has been, the least need for a big church at Cold Harbour. See Domesday. Why did the Saxons take the trouble to build one then? Obviously for the identical reasons that made Gaius stick up his altar and my wife her oratory. Fear, the need for protection. The Saxons came along and settled in Halesby, and when they'd been there a bit they began to hear whispers about that queer place in the trees at the foot of old Pen Beacon. Nasty, uncomfortable stories, of the kind that I'll bet my shirt that chatterbox Alma has been telling you at the Fox. And some old priest, who had a high sense of religious sanitation, said to himself, "This isn't healthy. I'm not going to have my congregation corrupted by mysteries of that kind. This is a powerful thing, and we must deal with it." So he dealt with it, according to the rules of the game, with book and bell and candle and aspersions of holy water, just as the abbot of St. Chad's did for my wife. First of all, by way of precaution, he put up the stone cross, the remains of which I'll show you in the churchyard later, and then, to make a clean sweep of it, he got to work on the church whose tower is still standing, and I dare say he died imagining that he'd scotched Cold Harbour for good and all. Anyhow, my point is this, that the Saxons found material here for heroic sanitary measures, and took them. Now we'll skip another century or two. Monastic history is a very ticklish subject. The old monks had a way of letting their pens run away with them, and their records are just about as trustworthy as historical novels. Still, I suppose there's a basis of truth in them. Well, in the Middle Ages, according to the Worcester records, this particular piece of ecclesiastical property fell into the hands of the Abbey of Halesby. Cistercians. If you have time to look at the ruins on your way, it's just barely worth while. They never had much to do with Cold Harbour, probably because the ugly stories were still hanging about it. What they did was to turn this building, or rather the east wing of it, into a house of correction, to which they banished members of their community who misbehaved themselves. According to the chroniclers, there must have been some pretty bad hats among them. I can't tell you what they did, but in Halesby there have always been traditional stories of their misbehaviour. Shenstone, the poet, must have got hold of some when he wrote about the abbey's dissolution, and the country people here are convinced that some of these malefactors were bricked up in the cellar of the house. I dare say they were. The parson we had here, Lowe, always maintained that the place had a bad effect on his morals. I don't know what it made him want to do, but he was a weak-kneed fellow of the type that always appeals to my wife in any case. And so it goes on. It does seem a fact that a certain number of people have always regarded Cold Harbour as a pretty hot spot, and history, up to a point, bears them out. Before the Reformation, they took measures accordingly. Then there was a good, sound, healthy religion that had experience of those things and knew how to deal with them. But after the Reformation, the English Church set up to be superior to superstitions, and kept the devil as a sort of nonconformist bogey to frighten children with. They didn't seriously believe in the powers of evil. They were such damned fine fellows. They thought that as long as they read their Bibles and said their prayers at bedtime, nothing could touch them. What they called their strength, I call their ignorance. And so, little by little, this is pure theory, mind you, all the old influences began to wake up and raise their heads, and said to each other, "These fellows think themselves just too clever to live. Isn't it about time we showed 'em?" And so they jolly well did. To some purpose, as my wife and her friends will tell you. Not that for a fraction of a second I'd admit it myself. Still, there's your explanation, if you really want one. For a moment Wake hesitated. Mr. Furnival left off suddenly, just like that. I wish I'd been able to give you the least impression of this apologia of his. Unhappily, it's quite beyond me. I've given you the substance along with an occasional phrase, generally a colloquialism, that has stuck in my mind, but what I can't give you is the infinite persuasiveness of his voice, which made the mere act of listening a sensual pleasure, and the feeling of knowledge and power that lay behind what he was saying. His theory, in point of fact, was just the sort of thing against which the doctor in me instinctively rebels, but the atmosphere that he conveyed with it was so strong that he almost carried me along with him. I looked at the others. There, on my left, was Mrs. Furnivall, pale, shrunken, always smiling. Opposite to me, flushed, bolt upright, stiff with alertness, sat Evelyn. I smiled across at her. Apparently she didn't see me. Her mind seemed concentrated on some inward struggle. For one horrid moment I thought she was ill. Then, suddenly, she slewed round face to face with Furnivall and spoke. "I don't believe a word of it," she said. The words took my breath away. It isn't usual to speak quite so emphatically to one's host. Mrs. Furnivall's face fell as though she feared some exhibition of violence. For an instant, Evelyn and Furnivall stared at one another. Then up went his moustache, and out came a cackle of laughter. "Brava!" he said. "You don't believe a word of it? Neither do I. I think, you know, that you and I should be friends." I held my breath. That, pretty obviously, wasn't what she meant. I knew her habits of directness, and couldn't guess what she'd say next. Luckily for all of us, she made no reply, and I myself butted in with an attempt to save the situation. "In any case," I said, "historically speaking, it's an interesting record. And of course it's just possible that past history may have something to do with your trouble." "I haven't any trouble," said Mr. Furnivall quickly. "But by your own admission," I said, "a certain number of people have. You yourself put it down at 60% of all your visitors. Well, that's a considerable proportion. In a court of law, you'd say there was a case for investigation." "Investigation!" he scoffed. "I've told you it doesn't affect me." "But it does affect your guests," I said. "They certainly don't like it." He laughed. "Well, then, they'll have to lump it," he said. "That's all very well," I told him, "but I don't think you're consistent. You're in love with the place. You've treasured every fragment of its history. You're interested in everything that belongs to it, and yet you cut out the most interesting thing about it, from a historical as well as scientific point of view. Don't you want an explanation?" "Not in the least," he said. "I tell you again, it doesn't affect me." Mrs. Furnivall shook her head. "It does affect him," she said. "It does." Mr. Furnivall jumped up nervously onto his long legs. His white hair seemed to bristle. He looked as if he could kill her. Then, apparently, he changed his mind and sat down again. "I should like to investigate it myself," I said. The word seemed to prick him on the raw. "Investigate, investigate," he repeated. "My dear sir, you're talking through your hat. There's nothing to investigate, and no one competent to do it." "Have you ever heard of the Society for Psychical Research?" I said. "There are a number of people with a large experience of this sort of thing who would be only too glad of the opportunity of examining your evidence." "I tell you there is no evidence," he persisted. "Oh, nonsense," I said. "There's a crowd of witnesses. Mr. Lowe, the governess, the abbot, Miss Harrow, your cousin, to say nothing of the children and Mrs. Furnivall herself." Once more he jumped up from his chair. "I say there are no witnesses!" he almost screamed. "Mr. Lowe is dead and buried somewhere in Africa. The abbot of St. Chad's has gone to Australia, begging. The others are scattered all over the world. And as for my wife," he spoke with a laugh of the most bitter scorn, "surely you, as a medical man, can judge by this time just how much her evidence would be worth." He controlled himself and went on more quietly. "Besides, in any case," he said, "you've got to realize that all this is ancient history. Since we've been living alone in this house without visits from her neurotic friends, there's been nothing to worry about. Until you came here today, we haven't even mentioned the matter for months. Upon my soul, I thought it had died a natural death." He spoke soberly, like a man with a just grievance. All through his outburst I had been watching Mrs. Furnivall. The insult that he had thrown at her, for he had practically suggested that she was insane, seemed to pass over her head as though it were quite an ordinary thing. Behind her pallid smile, I saw the contest in her puzzled mind reaching its climax. Probably she had taken new courage from her talk with Evelyn and our sympathetic presence. I saw her struggling for words, like a creature that has lost the habit of speech. Then, pulling all her courage together, she spoke. "It's not ancient history, Humphrey," she said. "Not by any means. During the last year I've never mentioned it because I knew what you would say, and I couldn't face it any longer. Jerry's as bad as ever. Every week, every day, it grows worse and worse. Of course, darling, you don't realize it. I thank God for your happiness that you don't. But it can't go on like this. It's reaching a point where it can't go any longer without something terrible happening. I know what we have to expect. All these materializations. Blood." She put her hands to her eyes. At first Mr. Furnivall had listened to her with a mocking smile, but when she came to the word materializations, his face changed. "Ah, that's it," he cried. "That's it, is it? Now I see where we are. Jane, you've been ferreting in my spook books. You needn't deny it. You've given yourself away, and by God, if I catch you doing that again, if I catch you—" The poor creature only shook her head from side to side, automatically, like a bear in a cage, and Furnivall, realizing, apparently, that the indecency of his outburst, tried to pass it off as a joke. "Well, I ask you," he said, "what in God's name can you do with a woman like that?" He burst into a cackle of unnatural laughter. "Blood, indeed!" He turned to me. "Doctor, do you ever allow your good wife to read medical books? Of course you don't. You know as well as I do that in 5 minutes she'd imagine she'd got cancer and diabetes and Addison's disease, whatever that may be. And it's just the same here. If they hadn't cost such a damned lot of money, I'd burn every one of them. And now you'll see why I lost my temper when you spoke of investigations. Anything to keep her mind off it. Don't you agree with me? Ha?" I didn't. The possibilities of the case and its mysteriousness were still buzzing in my head, but evidently he wished to change the subject. He took my arm with a hearty, hospitable gesture. "If you want to see the church by daylight," he said, "you'd better get a move on. There's that Saxon cross. I don't know if you're an authority on such things. You seem to have dabbled in most, but in any case, I'd like to have your opinion. I'm inclined to think it's our greatest treasure." He opened the door. The women passed out in front of us. The hall was dim and dank. As we entered it, I had a momentary vision of Mr. Furnivall taking off his boots by candlelight. My mind was prepared to see the unfortunate Miss Harrow flying downstairs with her hand to her torn face. Then Furnivall suddenly vanished from my side and took possession of Evelyn, leaving me behind with his wife. We followed the others into the garden. On the threshold she turned and gave me a look, the most beseeching that my eyes have ever encountered. I told myself quickly that she might be distraught, as Furnivall had suggested. But that wasn't what I saw. Nothing but the harrowed glance of a soul in torment entreating help that it was beyond my power to give. I don't think I have ever felt more deeply touched by any contact with humanity. Don't forget that I'm a doctor, and the doctors, in spite of the mask which necessity compels them to wear, are more sensitive to suffering than your laymen. In that moment I felt that I would sacrifice anything to give this woman comfort, but all that I could do, in fact, was to take her thin arm. "It is perfectly dreadful, isn't it?" she whispered. "Don't you think so? You see, he is the object of it all. It's all directed against him. under active control. That's what the medium told me. And I know for myself that it's true. You and your wife have been so kind to me, she said. She is the greatest dear, isn't she? How silly of me. I forgot to ask you. Are you a Catholic? I confessed that I wasn't. What a pity, she said. That is the only thing, isn't it? You'd know if you were in my shoes, and yet, in a way, it's fortunate, after all the things Mr. Furnivall has said about us. He doesn't mean them, you know. I think the words are put into his mouth from outside. We entered the churchyard. I felt that my opportunity was slipping away from me. This blood, I said, is it actually a fact that you have not only seen it, but been able to touch it? She looked at me wonderingly. Of course it's true, she said. Really, I'm not as imaginative as Mr. Furnivall makes out. I'm a very ordinary woman. In that case, I said, don't you think it's your duty, next time this occurs, to send the blood for analysis to North Bromwich? I'll give you the name of the professor of physiology. He's a friend of mine. She shook her head. My dear doctor, she said, can't you see that that's quite impossible? How could I do such a thing without Mr. Furnivall knowing? If he did know, he'd never permit it, and if he didn't, why, that would be deceiving him. Oh, no, I couldn't dream of it. But besides, it's to be expected. For the moment, I can't remember the name of the book. Dear, dear, my memory is simply awful, but... The voice of Mr. Furnivall interrupted us. Come along, doctor, or the light will be gone. She pressed my arm gently. You'd better go, she said. I don't know how to thank you. Tears came to her pathetic eyes. Meanwhile, I, Mrs. Wake continued, had managed to get in a few words with Mr. Furnivall, hating him like hell. He made it clear from the first that he didn't want to talk about the one thing that interested me, but I wasn't having any of that. Has it ever occurred to you, I said, that all the things about which we've been talking may have a serious effect on your wife's health? He stared at me and laughed. Well, naturally, he said, it can't be very good for her. That's what I try to impress on her. I want to tell you, I said, one curious thing that happened when we were coming downstairs. He took my arm with a familiarity that made me shiver. Now this, you see, he said, is undoubtedly Saxon work. But he couldn't put me off like that. Somehow I managed to get my arm away from him. Just as we were standing outside the door of the library, or whatever you call it, I told him, your wife stopped and said to me, Why, I believe they're quarreling. How dreadful of them. I thought I ought to tell you. I waited for him to reply. The hatred was simply boiling up in me. The light was so bad that I couldn't see his face. Then he burst out laughing in that horrible way of his, and turned round and called to Ronald to hurry up if he wanted to see the cross. I think your wife's a bad subject, Doctor, he said. You'd better take care of her. Bad subject indeed. Go on, Ronald. We had a good look at the cross in the twilight, Ronald Wake went on. Naturally, he knew a good deal more about it than I did. As a matter of fact, I didn't listen to him. By that time I'd had enough and more than enough of Cold Harbour and everything about it. My only anxiety was to get away, partly for my own sake, and very much more for Evelyn's. Without exchanging a word with her, I could see that she was near the end of her tether. I thanked him, formally, for his invitation and all he had shown us. I think he guessed my real feelings. At any rate, he seemed quite willing to let us go. We walked back together through the graveyard to the gate in the garden wall. We passed the front of that abominable house. The windows seemed to watch us lazily as we went. In front of the door, Furnivall halted. It's just occurred to me, he said, that poor Mrs. Wake has never seen the Martock manuscripts after all. That's your fault, Jane. Don't you think we'd better just run up to my study and have a look at them? I glanced at Evelyn. Even in the dusk I could see that nothing would induce her to do so. I think we're too late already, I said. I'm sorry. Why not let her speak for herself? he said. I heard Evelyn mutter, "No, thank you," in the strangest voice. Furnival laughed. "In that case, there's no point in standing here and catching our deaths of cold, ha!" We shook hands, with only vague words of thanks. His was a good, firm hand-clasp, and I shall never forget the pathetic softness of his wife's. It seemed to me like a callous and ghastly betrayal to leave her standing there on that damnable threshold. "If ever you're in London," I said, "St. Margaret's Hospital will find me. Our name's in the telephone directory." She thanked me, pathetically, and we went. I heard the voice of Furnival calling after us. "Never mind about the Martok manuscripts," he called. "We'll have a look at those next time." As if there would ever be one. We walked away beneath the ghostly autumnal trees. We went like ghosts. The leaves were so thick under our feet. It was as though death hung in the air. Something worse than death. I know death, and this was infinitely worse. Evelyn was tugging at my arm like a child who is cold and wants to run. I knew what she meant. We began running together, down the drive, into the road, running away from Cold Harbour, and feeling, all the time, the house behind us, lying there, like a stony monster, crouched, ready to strike. When once we were past the ghost hedge of beeches, we both slackened our pace instinctively. "Tell me, quickly, what do you think of him?" Evelyn said with a kind of gasp. "A devil or a criminal lunatic," I said. My voice trembled ridiculously. And we didn't speak another word until we reached the light of the Fox. There, Eve turned suddenly and looked at me. "Why, Ronald, what's the matter with you?" she said. "Your face, I mean." Then I burst out laughing. I knew that she had seen what I had felt from the first moment. "Your cheek," she said. "It's all funny, shriveled, drawn up like goose flesh." "As it has been, my child," I said, "ever since I set foot in that house." "While I'm burning, in a fever," she said. We found Alma waiting for us with a kettle on the boil in case we hadn't had tea. We didn't want any tea, but the girl hung around us as though she couldn't bear to part with us until she'd heard how we'd fared. As we got into the car and handed her her tip, she plucked up courage and spoke. "You didn't call me, ma'am. You didn't tell me, ma'am, what you thought of Cold Harbour and Mr. Furnival." For myself, I thought it better to say nothing, but Eve's feelings were so much on the surface that she couldn't resist the chance. "I think he's possessed by the devil, Alma," she said. "You're not the first to have said that, ma'am," said Alma eagerly. "Did you catch sight of Mrs. Furnival?" Well, that question I thought best unanswered, so I let in the clutch, and away we went. 5 hours hard driving. It wasn't until we reached the lights of the Uxbridge Road that we spoke more than a casual word to each other. All through the night, Cold Harbour kept us company. Hag-ridden was Furnival's own word. We sat there quietly, thinking and thinking, and when I put up the car in Wigmore Street, my silly face was still drawn up with Cold Harbour goose-flesh. We lay awake all night, talking. We had to get it over somehow. And yet, even when we had talked the matter through and through, it seemed to both of us as though the whole course of our lives had been changed, as if they'd been thrust out of their normal, peaceful orbit by a blow from something dark and invisible whirling out of space. We looked at each other anxiously at breakfast to make sure that we were the same people. I think we're sure of it now, but only just. Chapter 7. Symposium. "And that is the end of the story?" I said at last. "The end? Well, hardly that," Ronald Wake replied. During the latter part of his narration, his voice had taken on an emotional tone that was new to my ears, a strange quality, reinforced, as it seemed, by the silence of his wife and the intentness with which we listened to him. Now he was himself again, and the change, I must admit, was reassuring. "The end," he went on. is a matter that needn't immediately concern us. What Evelyn and I had tried to do is to give you an accurate and intimate account of our experiences, an experience of 2 hours at the outside, which impressed us both more than anything else in our lives. We've tried to express it as fully as possible, naturally coming to you at second and third hand. It must have lost a good deal of its force in the telling, but the facts, as far as we know them, are there. The facts, I mean, from which we've drawn our conclusions, and before we let you know anything of the sequel, we're both of us anxious to know what you make of them. We want to impanel you as members of a journey of God-fearing men, sitting in judgment on Cold Harbor and its inhabitants. After you've delivered your verdict, I'll tell you what, up to this point, we'd made of it ourselves. It's possible that you'll disagree with us and each other, and that'll only make it more interesting. Very well, I said. We'll do what you wish. On the face of it, the case belongs more to Mr. Hartley's province rather than to mine. It's one in which the parson takes precedence of the novelist, and so I think he'd better have the first go. No interruptions. That's agreed? Go on, Padre. That is just as you wish, said Hartley. Still, I think you're right. The problem is a spiritual problem, and, in my opinion, should be judged by religious standards. At the present moment, I admit, my head's rather a whirl. We live so materially in these days that any invasion of the spiritual finds us unprepared. Finds me unprepared, I should have said. That's a sad confession for a clergyman to make, but there it is. Still, I've been trying to look at it from the point of view that the Church adopts towards phenomena of this kind, and that has simplified it, as, of course, it always does. To begin with, I feel that we have no right to be surprised by anything you've told us. Shocked, yes, for it's all very dreadful, as that poor woman suggested, but not surprised. We are taught to believe in the eternal survival of all human spirits, and our experience, in all its records from the Bible onwards, has confirmed this belief. It's silly and thoughtless to ask Christian people if they believe in ghosts, because Christians can't disbelieve in them. So I don't think we've any right to reject any of the terrible things that Mrs. Furnivall told you, even if hers were the only evidence before us. And of course it isn't. Part of the evidence is traditional, and for that reason a good many people would refuse to admit it. I don't agree with them. Traditions may twist the forms of things, but they do, as a rule, preserve the substance, and when, as in this case, tradition is reinforced by the experience of living men and women, then tradition, in my opinion, becomes of the highest value. Let's take it for granted, then, that Cold Harbor has been haunted, as the saying is, for a great number of years, and is haunted to this day, by the spirits of its former occupants. Next, not because of any theological dogma, but because it does seem a matter of recorded fact, we believe that the spirits of the righteous who have found rest in God are never concerned in these manifestations, are never earthbound, as the phrase goes. Whenever cases of this kind are investigated to the extent of arriving at an explanation, we find that the spirits concerned in them are those of men and women who have died violent deaths, with some weight of sin or anxiety on their minds that has been sufficient to exclude them from the peace of heaven. And this case confirms that universal experience in the highest degree. All the apparitions of Cold Harbor seem to have been associated with scenes of blood and violence and horror that one might expect. But here we can go a step further. At Cold Harbor there appear to be a number of influences at work whose forces are definitely and actively evil, and as they are evil, so, proportionately, they are potent. In me, the mere appearance of these unhappy beings whose shadows have persisted at Cold Harbor would have inspired not dread, but pity. We know that such things are permitted, and that they are powerless to harm. Sometimes, by the exercise of religious rites and prayer, they can be put to rest. But the spirits that possess Cold Harbor, or some of them at least, are not of this category. The evidence of poor Mr. Lowe and the abbot of St. Chad's, and the very terrible story of Mrs. Furnivall's niece, Muriel, all show that an active spirit of evil and darkness, desperately opposed to the light of Christianity, a hostile and jealous spirit, has been allowed to exercise its power in that place. And that is only part of the story that is serious from my point of view. How serious, I find it difficult to imagine. Of course, there's nothing new in that, though, fortunately, it is the first case of the kind that has ever come to my notice in modern times. The early history of Christianity is full of such occurrences. We've no right to believe, for instance, that the temptation of St. Anthony is a fable, when the temptation of our Lord in the wilderness is on record. The youth of Christianity was full of contest. It had to fight its way, step by step, against the power of darkness. In those days they were so apparent that nobody dreamed of disputing the existence of the devil in all his multitudinous forms and devices. For 2,000 years that process of cleansing has been going on, and in these days the powers of light have triumphed so completely that the dark powers have sunk beneath our cognizance. I don't mean that the work of the devil is not apparent in the hearts of men, as any clergyman who hears confessions must realize day by day. The struggle is continued with an unceasing bitterness. What I mean to say is that in these days the contest is usually waged beneath the surface of ordinary sensual consciousness, with diminished prospects of success, and therefore, possibly, with increasing subtleness. If you want a parallel, the difference between the spiritual war of today and that of 2,000 years ago is the difference between a charge of pikemen and a wave of poison gas or bombs of noxious germs. The powers of darkness fight no longer in the open, but secretly and at long range. That is the explanation to which we have been accustomed. But in this case, it seems to me, the old conditions of warfare have been renewed. The enemy has taken courage and come into the open in a desperate attempt to regain his old position. How this has happened, I can't say. It's possible. Dr. Wake, no doubt, will correct me if I'm wrong. An idea has just come into my head. Isn't it a fact that the germs of disease sometimes seem to lie dormant and innocuous in the bodies of certain people, and then reappear, full of renewed virulence, in an epidemic? Wake nodded solemnly. Quite right. Carriers. That's just what I was thinking, Harley continued. By Mr. Furnivall's own showing, Cold Harbour has been for centuries an infected spot. I think he used that very figure when he talked about the Saxon's cross and the centurion's altar. First, the unimaginable rites of the Stone Age, the worship of dark spirits that gained power, as all spiritual forces do, from the devotion of human beings. Then, the abominable cult of Astarte, which historians tell us was one of the most powerful forces of antiquity. Then, the superstitious survivals which the Saxons had to fight against. Then, some hundreds of years later, the concentration on the same spot of heretical or recalcitrant monks, the very dregs of the old monastic system. Who can wonder that the germs of evil clung to such a place, finding in generation after generation of its occupants some individual carrier, in whose soul they might flourish with a sort of subdued virulence, awaiting the day when they might burst forth with the power that they have now assumed? Isn't that possible? Isn't that reasonable to suppose? You see, I find myself arguing into lines with Mr. Furnivall. I don't see any reason why I shouldn't do that. I think Dr. Wake treated his theory rather cavalierly. One could see that he was influenced by his dislike of the man's person and personality. But that, in a case of this kind, seems hardly fair. Of course, you may answer that Mr. Furnivall himself gave you the impression that he was arguing with his tongue in his cheek. That doesn't influence me. Mr. Furnivall, as I see him, is a man who prides himself, with good reason, as far as such things are a matter for pride, on the possession of a rational and scientific mind. That, in my own opinion, is a disqualification in considering matters of this kind. But he, like most modern people, thought otherwise, and when he expounded the theory that his heart suggested, he was ashamed of it. A very natural and a very human failing in these self-conscious days. And yet everything that you've told me about the man, and particularly his wife's account of him as a creature full of deep religious feeling, though his words don't always sound to me like those of an Anglican, incline me to think that beneath the rationalist surface, which he took pains to show you, his heart is that of a mystic and a believer, which pride in his own intellect and erudition have hardened. Laugh as he may, I believe that Mr. Furnival's theory is the product of his heart and of his conscience. Within the depths of these, he believes it himself. Naturally, he was reluctant to speak of such things. In these days, very few of us dare to do so, and, as he suggested to you himself, in a moment of self-distrust, his great anxiety was to keep away from the mind of his wife all references to a subject which had played such havoc with it. That, I admit, was not a courageous attitude, but in some ways it was excusable, particularly when you remember that he himself has so far been immune from, or at least ignorant of, the evil influences at work. I even think that Mrs. Furnival may have been right when she believed that it was part of the policy of these influences to keep him in ignorance, playing on the weakness of his intellectual pride to attain their object. It seems to me a subtle and devilish way of retaining their power over the place, to convince its owner that they don't exist. From every point of view, I think that Mr. Furnival is to be pitied. If only some heavenly revelation could open his eyes. That is the solution to which our prayers should be directed, the only solution that, at present, occurs to my mind. He stopped. For a little while we sat on in silence. Then I spoke. "Supposing, Padre," I said, "that Mr. Furnival's eyes should be opened to the enormity of the present conditions, what would you advise him to do?" Harley rose from his chair in the shadows, a dark, lank, prophetic figure, curiously different from the shy, boyish creature that we knew. "There is only one thing," he said. "It seems that all ordinary means have failed to remove the infection. As long as that house stands, it will remain a danger to human souls. I should destroy it. I'd burn it to the ground." He relapsed into his chair. Ronald Wake turned to me. "Well," he said. "To tell you the truth," I began, "you've put me in an awkward position. I must warn you to begin with that I'm going to disagree with your other jurymen, and I want to make it clear before I express my differences that there's more in them than a natural disinclination to accept supernatural explanations for the things that you've told us. I may as well confess that I'm prejudiced by the fact of my earthly encounters with Mr. Furnival. Mr. Harley has given us a very plausible and humane explanation of Mr. Furnival's attitude, which I can't accept, because whatever virtues Furnival may possess, I'm convinced that simplicity isn't one of them. So that, even if I felt inclined to accept Furnival's own theory at its face value, which I don't, I know quite well that I'd be bound to turn it down simply because it happens to be his. I don't claim that the impressions of childhood, which are all I have to build on, are infallible, but I do hold the conviction that in Mr. Furnival we're dealing with an extremely complicated personality, who mustn't be judged by the standards of good faith that Harley has applied to him. And it seems to me that Furnival's attitude must be the key to this extraordinarily intricate situation. Not that I find any fault with the historical basis of his history. I've no doubt in my mind that he's correct in his details. It's more or less his own subject. He studied it deeply, and is far too conscientious an artist, that's the word, to weaken his story by introducing anything of doubtful authenticity. I'm willing to take it from him that everything points to Cold Harbor having been a religious site for more than 2,000 years. I accept his explanation of the Astarte affair, of the Astarte altar and the Saxon cross, the incongruously elaborate church. I'm ready to believe that in the Middle Ages Cold Harbor became a penitentiary for the abbey at Halesby. I admit that the place has observed a bad name all through its history, that it's been, as he called it, a pretty hot spot. I'm even ready to admit that this unsavory history may have had something to do, I won't put it more definitely than that, with all these ghostly phenomena. But as for explaining them completely, that's another matter altogether. Of course, we don't know much about ghosts. Mr. Harley would tell you that we're not meant to know much about them, but that's a point of view that my scientific education won't let me accept. It's my belief that in years to come, the founders of the SPR will be regarded with the reverence that science owes them. At present, they haven't managed to do more than collect a mass of evidence which establishes the existence of phantasms and phenomena of the kind which the Furnival's Jerry provided it. Let's deal with Jerry first, for I'm inclined to think that he may provide us with our key. He's the common or garden poltergeist, a mischievous, childish, inconsequent force that seems capable of expressing itself through ordinary physical channels. There are any number of such things on record. Wesley's is a classic example because, I suppose, the evidence of such a sober and reasonable man as Wesley must be accepted. Then there's a furniture-moving poltergeist, first cousin to Jerry, at Magdalen College, Cambridge, and I know of another who occupies the attic of a man of letters who lives near Salisbury. Now, the Furnival's Jerry is a very versatile member of his species. The trick that he played on Mr. Lowe was extremely ingenious. It almost suggests a rudimentary sense of humor, as does the incident of the governess's watch. The furniture-moving business is merely silly and irritating, though actually more typical, while the accident of Miss Harrow and her torn cheek implies a very unusual maliciousness. There remains the incident of the broken chalice. That, of course, is very remarkable, and religious-minded people must be excused if they regard it with horror, for although it's possible that this freakish force may have stumbled on the most obvious way of teasing the abbot of St. Chad's, it really does look as if its choice has been directed by a malignant intelligence. Purposely or accidentally, the gesture was remarkably effective, and when Mrs. Furnival found it perfectly dreadful, I quite agree with her. Very well. Now let's consider poltergeists in general. So far as I know, there is just one thing that has been established about them, and that is that their power of expression seems always to depend on the presence of one particular person. Note that the person concerned may be totally unaware of his or her connection with the phenomena. You may remember a case recently recorded in the eastern countries. A case recently recorded in the eastern counties. It took place in the house of a clergyman. Curious, Padre, how the members of your calling seem to be pestered, and the person round whom the manifestation centered was a small and not very intelligent servant girl. As soon as she was removed from the parsonage, the phenomenon ceased. That's my significant point. It seems to me remarkable that, though Cold Harbor had what we agreed to call a bad reputation for years before the Furnivals took it, there's no local record of poltergeist phenomena having occurred before they entered it. Supposing that some member of the Furnival household is responsible, unconsciously maybe, for the whole business. Let's argue along those lines. First of all, we can dismiss the children. At the present time, they've all gone out into the world, yet, as Mrs. Furnival told you, Jerry is as bad as ever. At present, also, there's only one maid in the house, the creature with the medieval face whom you saw through the kitchen window. She happens to be just the right sort of person, and seemed to fit the case until I realized that Jerry had begun his tricks before she came, in the days of Rose. That leaves us with nobody but Mr. and Mrs. Furnival, and here, unfortunately, we can't argue by exclusion, for Mrs. Furnival never leaves the house, and nothing ever happens to her husband. So there we are, in a blind alley as far as Jerry is concerned, but so near to a solution that a series of simple experiments might decide. Mr. Furnival doesn't like experiments. Perhaps he knows. But still, we're only on the outer edge of your mysteries. I haven't mentioned, so far, the series of apparitions. On the surface, they're not very extraordinary. I mean that you could find a dozen of the same kind in the proceedings of the SPR. However, we'll try to deal with them as we dealt with Jerry, in the light, I mean, of the theory generally accepted. Roughly speaking, it's this. The thing that we've labeled ether, although nobody has the faintest idea what the ether is supposed to be capable of receiving and retaining impressions of light and sound at various times, at certain times when the events from which these impressions arise are intensified by some extremity of emotion in a human soul. It's only in such an emotional extremity as is reached, say, at the moment of death, that the soul is able to implant these impressions on that everlasting and unchanging medium. Probably other physical conditions of which we are ignorant are involved. For example, the shape of rooms. Even acoustics, as everyone knows, is a mystery rather than a science. At any rate, the ether, under these conditions, is more or less comparable to a gramophone record, which is nothing more than a sheet of wax with lines of varying depth until it is attached to some mechanism of transmission. We'll think of the ether, then, as an indestructible record holding these impressions eternally and secretly until the moment when it makes contact with a suitable instrument of transmission in the soul of one of those people whom the spiritualists call sensitives and Mrs. Furnival calls unlucky. Now comes our first difficulty. The typical ghost story is this. In certain places, at certain hours, with certain people, certain things are imagined, heard, or seen. If our gramophone theory is valid, it couldn't be otherwise, for the impression on the wax doesn't change, and a disc can only play one tune. But at Cold Harbour, according to what you have told us, apart from certain apparitions which are true to type and so familiar that Mrs. Furnival, by her own account, takes no heed of them, the ghostly phenomena are all different and never repeated, so varied, in fact, that they give one the effect of improvisations or new inventions. Of course, it's possible that the ether at Cold Harbour has an inexhaustible repertory of ancient horrors, but with the same instruments of transmission available over a long period, it seems strange that each tune should not have been repeated. It looks as though the accepted theory will have to be abandoned in this case. Nobody regrets that more than I do, because I'd like to comfort myself with a quasi-scientific explanation, and this forces me into the region of the supernatural, where, frankly, I'm not at home. It's this element of improvisation that bothers me. I wonder if it wasn't some difficulty of the same kind that made Mrs. Furnival's medium friend declare that the phenomena were under active control. Control is a word out of the spiritualistic vocabulary, and therefore I'm suspicious of it. But it does seem, somehow, to describe the thing that I can't explain. I have adopted it because it enabled me to improvise a theory just about as plausible as that which Mr. Harley evoked from his medical metaphor. Just about as plausible as that which Mr. Harley evolved from his medical metaphor. We've already decided that Jerry is only able to act by virtue of the presence of some human individual. In this case, you have to toss up between Mr. and Mrs. Furnival. The presence of this individual liberates Jerry's powers in a series of physical phenomena. Suppose, then, that we imagine the existence of other forces incapable of Jerry's powers of physical expression, but capable of influencing the mental processes, vision, hearing, and so on, of living people, through the presence of an agent in the same manner as the poltergeist. If we are willing to swallow the camel, we can't strain the gnat, though personally I'd much rather do neither. You remember Mrs. Furnivall's medium, who said that all the horrors of Cold Harbour were directed at Mr. Furnival? At him is not the phrase I want. Why not through him, or through her? It doesn't matter which, for either offers us a possible explanation for the variety of the Cold Harbour apparitions. But even if we accept that, we're not at the end of our puzzle. We can't pick and choose the things we want to explain, and after we've dealt with Jerry and the apparitions, we're left face to face with something much less tangible, the influence of evil, the corruption of character, the impulse to do Mrs. Furnivall's cryptic evil things. Whatever that may be, the influence that can make a mitred abbot unable to pray must be a pretty powerful one. Mr. Lowe, too, and Cousin Muriel. That, I confess, beats me. I can't offer any plausible explanation. My imagination carries me no further. Only people with religious experience are competent to discuss a matter of that kind, so I leave it alone. All I'll say is this, that these parsons seem to have thrown up the sponge pretty quickly. What do you think, Harley? Honestly, I can't blame them, he replied. It seems to me that they did what they could. Beyond that point, the Church, particularly the Roman Church, discourages investigation. Very well, then, I said, we'll leave it at that. There's only one other point, the blood. On that, at least, Wake and I have a right to speak. When Evelyn first told us of that incident, she cut short all my theorizing. There was something tangible and material that one could take away with one and analyze. Evelyn's sharp mind realized this as quickly as I did. And now comes a curious point. When Furnival, an engineer, another man with a scientific mind, hears for the first time of this material piece of evidence, he reacts in a totally different way. He flies into a rage. Jane, you've been ferreting in my spook books, and threatens her, instead of admitting at once that here was something worth investigating. His whole attitude seemed to me so unnatural that I became suspicious, and the fact that he explained his sudden loss of control by solicitude for Mrs. Furnivall's nerves didn't reassure me when I considered the gross spiritual cruelties he'd been inflicting on her all afternoon. During the last moments, Harley, who had sat listening to me with his head in his hands, began to show a sudden restlessness, leaning forward in his chair as though he'd like to launch his body into the middle of the argument. At this point he broke in with an interruption. "Excuse me," he said. "I know that this is against the rules of the game, but honestly I can't help it. This blood, you know." "Fire away," I said. "This blood that you people insist on regarding in a scientific light, hasn't it struck you that the whole hagiology of the Church is saturated with the idea of materializations of this kind? The stigmata of the saints, the yearly liquefaction of the blood of Saint Januarius. Why, daily, hourly, the miracle of the Eucharist is taking place in Christian churches all over the globe. You see my point?" he added eagerly. "Perfectly," I told him. "It's a good one. Curious that it hadn't occurred to me before. But it doesn't affect my argument, which is just this. The appearance of blood in that house was a phenomenon for which Mr. Furnival might easily be responsible, if one could think the man capable of such devilry. According to Alma Higgins, the country people did, and so did you two after a couple of hours in his company. Certainly there was something extremely ugly in his callousness towards his wife and the other unlucky ones at Cold Harbour. That thick curtain slung between his bed and Mrs. Furnivall's is a sinister piece of furniture. And yet, before one looks for a motive in the persecution, it's one's duty to establish the possibility of his being responsible. You can't. Apart from that one incident of the blood, There's nothing in the whole story with which you can connect him, unless it be the relatively unimportant furniture-moving pranks that we've already ascribed to Jerry. In the case of the broken chalice, the body on the floor, and Miss Harrow's torn face, Mrs. Furnival herself gives us his alibi, and in all the phenomena which Mr. Harley thinks more serious, the atmospheric influence that urges Mrs. Furnival's mind to evil and prevents her parson friends from praying, it seems quite impossible that he should have been concerned. The evidence forces me to acquit him, and so I shall have to fall back on my explanation of the poltergeist theory, which, I admit, only covers part of the field. Mr. Harley's theory, in point of fact, is the only one that will explain everything. Unluckily, I'm constitutionally unable to accept it. So I may as well confess myself beaten, unless, of course, you have any other evidence to offer us. As a matter of fact, said Ronald Wake quietly, there is other evidence, but as it came into our hands considerably later, I don't propose for the moment to make you acquainted with it. What I wanted to do, and what I've done, was to put you in the same position as ourselves at the time when we left Cold Harbour, and to compare your conclusions with our own. I can assure you that we've been through it all. There's practically nothing that you and Mr. Harley have said that hasn't, at some time or another, passed through our minds, with just the one difference that all our conjectures were coloured by our dislike for Furnival, and that, for this reason, we weren't inclined to accept anything that came from his lips. Evelyn more positively than myself. From the moment when she met Furnival's eyes in the library and shouted to herself, "You are the devil in this house," she was completely satisfied that he was at the bottom of the whole business. She believes that instincts of this kind are infallible, and I'm not sure that she isn't right. I wish I had them myself. Well, there we were, in the same position as yourselves. We started off in the same way, and one by one we found ourselves up against the same obstacles. The thing that struck us most of all was exactly what troubled you, the element of improvisations, as you called it, which puts the good old gramophone theory out of court, and drives one back to Mrs. Furnival's active control. Now, Evelyn was convinced, and I was inclined to agree with her, that this control emanated from Mr. Furnival. The first snag we had to deal with was Furnival's series of alibis. They had always seemed to me too carefully established to be healthy. That underlining, for instance, of the fact that he was taking off his boots in the hall when Miss Harrow's face was torn, seemed so triumphantly deliberate. It was all very well distrusting Furnival's alibi, but there they were, quite definite and unshakable, and the fact remained that nearly every incident of importance had occurred while he was at a distance. Still we couldn't be satisfied. By day and night we thought and talked the matter out, and whatever line of conjecture we followed, we always came back to Furnival as the fountain origin. His face and figure seemed to dominate the whole problem, almost as if he were present in the spirit at our deliberations. And so, gradually, we found ourselves being drawn back into a conception of the affair which evidently hasn't occurred to either of you, though I must confess it's been enormously strengthened by what you've told us tonight of your early encounter with the man at Dulston. That, thanks to you, is where my story begins. I want you to picture him just as you saw him on the day when he arrived unexpectedly at Morehouse's cottage, a figure of terrific force, bodily and spiritual, a commanding personality, the most remarkable man in the Midlands, your friend called him, and such a restless, vigorous mind, not only a towering figure in his profession, which is a life's work for anyone, but a keen archaeologist, full of historical erudition, artistic, imaginative, and, at the same time, exceptionally skilled and far-seeing in affairs. So much for his capabilities. Now consider his domestic character. The first thing that strikes one is his attitude towards his unfortunate wife, who must have been, in those days, a reasonably attractive woman. At that curious Sunday dinner party he entirely neglected her. He only introduced her to Moor House as an afterthought, and never addressed a word to her during the whole meal. More than that, he openly humiliated her in the most scandalous way by his attention to the governess. And that isn't the only way in which his strain of cruelty shows itself. In the same open, ruthless fashion, he embarrasses the poor girl with whom he's flirting by whispering indecencies to her. I can still see your picture of the children, those wretched, cowed little animals, sitting at the table without daring to open their mouths, and, even more, that of the unfortunate infant being dragged in to be made drunk with the port. All these things, in my mind, are cruel and devilish, though Mr. Furnival, as it seems, thought them merely amusing. Very well. Here you have an intellectual Superman, a monster of intellect I should almost call him, sensual, cruel, enormous in all his appetites, a religious bigot, an artist, perilously sensitive to beauty and greedily seeking ugliness, prepotent, insatiable, at the very zenith of his power. And then comes the crash. The most precious of all his schemes, the one in which he's proved himself to be in advance of his time and molded the wills of his most important contemporaries to his own, fails suddenly, dramatically, with the catastrophe of a Greek tragedy, and down goes Furnival like a log on the boardroom floor. When he recovers himself, according to Mrs. Furnival, he's a changed man, but not a broken man. He declares to her that he will never work again, but that in itself is evidence that his will has survived. He acts ruthlessly, without hesitation. He cuts his losses, gets rid of the house at Dulston, which has been one of his masterpieces, and whirls the whole family away into Devonshire to vegetate for 12 months amongst his books. Vegetation, in this case, isn't only a relative term. The man's mind and body are equally incapable of inactivity. He spends his strength in immense walks. He scours the whole length of the country on a bicycle, looking for a place in which to store his library and settle down again. He finds it in Cold Harbour, within sight of the headgear of fatherless Bairn, an eternal, irritating reminder of his great failure. The family, poor things, are whirled back into the Midlands. Mr. Furnival throws himself into the job of restoring Cold Harbour with all his old passion and erudition and taste. He falls in love with the place. The fact that his wife dislikes it from the first doesn't count with him. He's infatuated with it and determined to make it satisfy his desire. The household is kept short of servants on plea of expense, and Mrs. Furnival works herself to a shadow, while thousands of pounds worth of beautiful things contribute to his ideal of beauty in the house. He sweeps into it like a tornado. Like himself, it becomes a new and dominating factor in his life. At last they are established. Cold Harbour approximates itself to his vision. In a short time he reaches a point when there is nothing more to be done with it, and he is finished with work. Up there on the skyline the headgear of fatherless Bairn stands to remind him of that decision. And Furnival isn't the kind of man who can change his mind. He's too proud for that. But he can't be idle. He's still in possession of immense reserves of energy without any medium for expressing them. He's still full of the lust of power, without any material on which to exert it. He's made himself king of a desert island, Napoleon on Elba. For a man of Furnival's temperament, the situation is impossible. Somehow or other, he must assert himself. He does so by quarrelling with his neighbours, and that's a poor sport. Everyone in the Midlands knows all about the failure of fatherless Bairn, and can throw that in his face. He falls back on his books, and increases his already enormous store of erudition, making himself master of strange new provinces of learning. Now wait a moment. It was at this point in my imagination that I began to see light. Darkness, if you prefer the word. I was thinking myself backwards into Furnivall's study, and became consciously aware, for the first time since I'd left it, of his particular concentration on the old religions and the psychic problems involved with them. I've already called him a medievalist. When I did that, I had nothing in my mind but the spurious medievalisms of the pre-Raphaelite era in art. But now I began to see that his medievalism was deeper than that he'd managed, in fact, to identify himself with the life of the period of which Mr. Harley was talking just now, a period when men were acutely aware and afraid of the surviving powers of paganism, whatever that may have been. Don't imagine for a moment that I myself take these powers seriously, or that Furnivall treated them for anything but an academic point of view. All I want you to do is picture Furnivall, led by the traditions of Cold Harbour, to saturate himself in the most curious records of those dark ages, among which the literature of black magic takes an important place. It's possible that this new interest was only one expression of his passionate interest in Cold Harbour. The very stones of the place were soaked in associations of that kind, but you mustn't forget that the man's nature, as shown by his incongruous religious convictions, had a bias in that mystical direction. And then, to the delight of his inquiring spirit, he finds that the house is infested with memories that take a positive shape in ghostly apparitions and in poltergeist tricks. This, in a certain way, is only an extension of his subject. It opens a field beyond that which he's already explored. His restless, energetic mind embraces it with the same fury of concentration, and he makes himself master of that as well. Now, for one moment, consider again those two radical characteristics of the man, his lust for power and his strange strain of cruelty. I don't think, as a matter of fact, that the first ever exists without the second. And imagine, again, the savage joy that he must have taken in finding that his wife, the object against which most of his cruelty had been directed, was suffering from these spiritual torments. I don't think that anyone who hasn't seen them together can quite appreciate the fervor of his hatred for that small creature, a hatred that probably gained in refinement from her devotion to himself, and was aggravated by jealousy of anything that tended to diminish her complete subjection to him, such as her children, her spiritual advisers, and her friends. These, you will notice, apart from Mrs. Furnivall herself, became the principal objects of the ghostly terrors that followed. To me, that is significant. I don't mean, let me make this quite clear, that Cold Harbour, apart from Furnivall, was an innocent place. I'm not sure that I don't agree with Mr. Harley's verdict that it should be destroyed. What I do mean is this, that Furnivall, consciously and deliberately, set about magnifying the horrors that existed, with the combined purpose of gratifying his lust for power and venting his natural cruelty. How did he do it? Well, that's a difficult question. At first, no doubt, in a clumsy and elementary way. That curtain in the bedroom is a device comparable with a medium's cabinet. Furnivall, you may be quite sure, knew all about the mechanics of the medium stock and trade. In this category of early experiments, I should put most of his augmentations of the Jerry phenomena, which are only protected by Mrs. Furnivall's alibis, evidence carefully planted by Furnivall in a subject and credulous brain. It's only when we come to the incident of the torn cheek, the children's apparitions, and the alarming spiritual frustrations of Mrs. Furnivall's niece and her advisers, that we have to look further afield for an explanation. In all these persecutions, at any rate, a motive is easily found. With the children, the motive is jealousy, and a knowledge that it was through them that Mrs. Furnivall's soft heart could be most deeply wounded. With Mr. Lowe, the confidant, jealousy again. With the abbot of St. Chad's, something more, the hatred of a bigot for a religion other than his own, and the fear that through this religion his ascendancy was threatened. With Miss Harrow, another motive appears. This unfortunate young woman had been foolish enough to challenge Furnivall's power. "You needn't think you can frighten me," she says, and Furnival picks up her gauge. But how did he carry it off in all these cases? By this time you may take it for granted that he'd mastered his subject, but, even so, I'm not going to ask you to believe that his textbooks of black magic enabled him to prevent a mitred abbot from praying. The effective part of black magic, as far as it ever achieved anything, was, in my opinion, the power of hypnotic suggestion. And that was the science in which Mr. Furnival became an adept. That was the channel into which, I believe, he diverted his torrential energy and will. As a basis, he found, ready at hand, the traditions and the admitted ghostly phenomena of Cold Harbour, which produced an atmosphere of uncertainty, if not of fear, in all that entered the house. I've had some experience of that, and can vouch for it myself, and on this basis, little by little, he erected the superstructure of horrors under which poor Mrs. Furnival's reason was tottering when we met her. Possibly, in the early stages, he didn't realize the potentialities of his talent, but when once hypnotic subjection is established, there are no limits to the powers of suggestions once implanted, even though the subject be at a distance from the hypnotist. Furnival's telepathic power, I admit, was no ordinary power, but Furnival, as his whole history shows us, is no ordinary man. I doubt if a more extraordinary man exists. Now let me anticipate an objection. Science holds, and probably rightly, that no hypnotist can establish his influence without intimate contact with his subject. In the case of Mrs. Furnival and her children, the fact presents no difficulty. In the case of Mrs. Furnival's niece, Muriel, it seems to me profoundly significant that during the 2 hours that preceded her religious perversion, she was sitting next to Furnival in church. She even begged him to let her go, but he wouldn't. And equally significant, to my mind, are the long evenings which Mr. Lowe and the abbot of St. Chad's spent in religious discussions with Mr. Furnival in his study. You may be certain that Furnival didn't insist on the abbot's company because he loved him. Not a bit of it. But by that time Furnival knew exactly the conditions that were necessary to the exhibition of his power, and made certain that they should be fulfilled. No doubt, also, he was lucky in his human material. A pack of neurotic women, he called them. But Evelyn isn't neurotic. I can answer for that. And yet, by some means or other, he was able to divine her interest in Martok. Remember that. And so, having once discovered his unique power, he goes from strength to strength, from audacity to audacity, until he knows that the minds of 60% of the people who enter the doors of Cold Harbour are potentially in his power. Evelyn and myself happened to be bad subjects. That day he drew a blank, and possibly worse than a blank, but that was because of our good fortune, not because of any lapse of power, and, as it was in my own case, I can assure you it was touch and go. Within another hour or two, God only knows what phantoms he might have grafted on to my brain. As luck would have it, he failed, and sent me away with nothing more serious than goose flesh. But nobody need try to persuade me, in future, that the devil doesn't exist. I have seen him and spoken with him. He stopped speaking suddenly. His silence invited our discussion, but to me, at any rate, it seemed as if his case was more convincing than my own. It was true that it carried the theory of suggestion beyond any limits that I'd ever imagined, and yet it gave my materialistic mind an intense relief to find itself near to the bounds of science. It was curiously sweet to feel the solid earth beneath my feet again, and something of the same relief, I think, must have come to Harley, for he, in his dark corner, made no comment. For the moment, it seems as if the darkness of another world was lifted from us, and the story, which had carried us into regions where our imaginations shuddered and were lost, returned to the familiar plane of human reason. But, as Wake had forewarned us, we knew that it was not yet finished. Harley was the first to break the silence. "So much for our theories," he said. "Between the three of them, there seems to me very little to choose. For the sake of our poor human faith, it is to be hoped that yours is the right one. And in any case, explanations are unimportant. The thing that remains with me and leaves me full of horror is your picture of that sad little woman, as you left her standing on the steps of the porch, with the night falling, and you two, the only link she had with normal humanity, turning the corner, leaving her alone, or rather worse than alone. If you had ended on that note, it's difficult to imagine how such things are permitted. And yet one feels that, sooner or later, Providence—" He stopped, as though he couldn't find the words to continue. My goodness, these authors 100 years ago went in for long chapters, didn't they, chat? God, what have I only been streaming for 2 hours? Feels like longer, but then perhaps it is because it's late and I was more tired than I thought. Oh, sorry about your headache, Chameleon Cat. I hope that goes away. Ooh, lovely, we've bots here. Oh, Jabberwocky, hey! Thank you so much for lurking from work. Give you a shout out. I hope your workday is going well. And you guys, please go check out Jabberwocky. Right, I didn't know you streamed for a while. Oh, you're playing Dispatch. It's that new episodic game, kind of reminiscent of Telltale, isn't it? Seeing a couple of people playing that seems interesting. Oh yeah, my pleasure, Jabu. And maybe I should go with shorter streams, but they do take it out of me after a certain point. It'd be easier if I could take a break in the middle. Oh, it was really good. Oh, nice. I'll have to check that out. Especially since, I love Telltale games so much. Eventually, gotta get my hands on a copy of Sam and Max Season 3 one of these days. And others. Interesting book. There's a lot more time getting to the horrific aspects and then analyzing them than I think a modern story would. But I'm interested to see where it goes next, and I think how much longer would we have? Just under 60 pages left. Really, we did 60 tonight. Probably I'll try and finish it in one more audiobook stream, which I don't know. Maybe in 2 weeks. I do want to finish it before I head home for Christmas. But I should find somebody to raid, and then I'll tell you, chaps, what's coming up on stream. Dear. See still. Trade. Oh, James with Johnny is playing Zombie Wars, the sequel to Alien Carnage. It's Jason playing. Is that Marathon 2 or is that a ROM for it? I rated him not that long ago. He rated. What's DJ playing? Oh, is it his 5-year stream anniversary? 5 years a streamer. Is that a reference to 5 Days a Stranger, the second game I ever streamed on Twitch? Yeah, we should raid Mr. CJ. Being a special occasion. But, I don't know if I know I was going to try and do a bonus short horror stream to make up for missing one, but I don't know if I will. But on Saturday, we'll play, for Short Horror Saturday, we'll try and play some horror game involving turkeys and Thanksgiving, or at the very least, chickens. And Sunday, it's possible I'll do the belated Halloween special. Depends if I can finish. And if not, then we'll be continuing Nancy Drew, the White Wolf of Icicle Creek. And then Wednesday, we'll continue a Nameless Inheritance. So, fun things coming up. And I'll probably do my streamiversary in 3 weeks, and I'll have to figure out what the hell I'm doing for that. Indeed, what the hell I'm doing in my life. It's not worth banning the bots at this point. Thank you, chaps, for coming to hang out. Enjoying more late-night ASMR audiobooks of the horror variety. All perfectly legal since it's public domain. In my country. Can't speak for everyone's countries. Oh yeah, speaking of my country, happy Thanksgiving again to everybody who celebrated. But I appreciate all the chatters and all the lurkers. And you guys can find me on Twitter and MySpace, where I post stream announcements and random stuff. And you can find VODs of my past streams up on YouTube. I hope that everybody has a good night. Wish Mr. CJ a happy 5-year streamiversary. And I'll see you guys Saturday, I reckon.